So what I'm going to do is I'm going to demonstrate the process of annotation. I'll demonstrate how, if I was taking a particular text, the way that I would read it and the thought process I would go through as I was reading it, and the annotation process I would do. To be honest, I'd probably annotate more thoroughly in an actual book, but it's a little bit more difficult electronically. So the first thing obviously I want to do is I want to start reading, and I'm going to read the first few paragraphs of this text, which is chapter 3 of The Awakening. It was 11 o'clock that night when Mr. Pontellier returned from Klein's hotel. He was in an excellent humor, in high spirits, and very talkative. His entrance awoke his wife, who was in bed and fast asleep when he came in. He talked to her while he undressed, telling her anecdotes and bits of news and gossip that he had gathered during the day. From his trousers pockets he took a fistful of crumpled banknotes and a good deal of silver coin, which he piled on the bureau indiscriminately, with keys, knife, handkerchief, and whatever else happened to be in his pockets. She was overcome with sleep, and answered him with little half-utterances. He thought it was very discouraging that his wife, who was the sole object of his existence, evinced so little interest in things which concerned him, and valued so little his conversation. Okay, so the first thing that I notice is that she makes a big deal about talking about it's 11 o'clock at night, right? He wakes his wife up from a sound sleep. She's fast asleep when he comes in. He's talking to her. It says again at the end, she's overcome with sleep and answered him with little half-utterances. So she's fast asleep, and yet he's waking her up and expecting her to pay attention to him, even though, that's a bit inconsiderate. And notice also, one thing that I find really interesting is that what he's talking to her about isn't particularly important. It says here, anecdotes and bits of gossip. So this isn't something that was important that needed her to wake up. He wants her to pay attention to him. And I find this, basically, it's inconsiderate of his behavior. And then notice also, it says here that she was the sole object of his existence. Whoops. I'm going to erase that and do that over. Sorry. She was the sole object of his existence, and yet she valued so little his conversation. That's kind of his reaction to that. I mean, what does he expect? He's woken her up in the middle of the night. I find this to be a bit juvenile. It's a bit childish, right? That he's done this, his reaction to it. So after that he goes on, Mr. Pontellier had forgotten the bonbons and peanuts for the boys. Notwithstanding, he loved them very much, and went into the adjoining room where they slept to take a look at them and make sure they were resting comfortably. The result of his investigation was far from satisfactory. He turned and shifted the youngsters about in bed. One of them began to kick and talk about a basket full of crabs. Mr. Pontellier returned to his wife with the information that Raoul had a high fever and needed looking after. Then he lit a cigar and went and sat near the open door to smoke it. Mrs. Pontellier was quite sure Raoul had no fever. He had gone to bed perfectly well, she said, and nothing had ailed him all day. Mr. Pontellier was too well acquainted with fever symptoms to be mistaken. He assured her the child was consuming at that moment in the next room. He reproached his wife with her inattention, her habitual neglect of the children. If it was not a mother's place to look after children, whose on earth was it? He himself had his hands full with his brokerage business. He could not be in two places at once, making a living for his family on the street, and staying at home to see that no harm befell them. He talked in a monotonous, insistent way. Okay, so what I notice here, right, is again he goes into the room where the kids are sleeping, and yet he wakes them up so that they're in bed, to his satisfaction, which maybe not waking up your children would be the good thing to do at this time of night. Comes back in the room. He's upset with his wife, although he doesn't admit that he's upset with her. And so he tells her that, Raoul has a fever. Notice that he sort of drops this information, but then he lights a cigar and he goes and outside and smokes it. So I think this is indicative here of a couple places here of gender roles that the two of them have. Notice that here he expects her to take care of the children, and then here he talks about the fact that she's supposed to be a wife and mother. He is the one that earns the living. he can't be at places at once, and why isn't she better at being a mother? So notice that Mrs. Pontellier basically says she's quite sure Raoul had no fever. You get the feeling that this particular family, these parents are fighting over this child, not necessarily out of concern for the child as they are so much as that this is Mr. Pontellier's passive-aggressive way. Because notice he says he reproaches his wife with her inattention, her habitual neglect of the children. That is an extraordinarily strong word there. That phrase, neglect, right? Neglect is a big deal, and it's habitual. Basically, he's critical of her as a mother, right? And you get the feeling that part of the reason he was because, frankly, she hurt his feelings by not being more interested in this conversation. And this is his way of getting back at her. So the child, whether or not the kid has a fever, has more to do with this power struggle between this particular couple, right? And one of the ways that you can tell that is that if you look at the way he says it, he talked in a monotonous, insistent way. There doesn't seem to be any emotional attachment to the criticism, right? It's just basically he's throwing a tantrum. So, let's move on to the next part. Mrs. Pontellier sprang out of bed and went into the next room. She soon came back and sat on the edge of the bed, leaning her head down on the pillow. She said nothing, and refused to answer her husband when he questioned her. When his cigar was smoked out, he went to bed, and in half a minute he was fast asleep. Mrs. Pontellier was by this time thoroughly awake. She began to cry a little, and wiped her eyes on the sleeve of her peignoir. Blowing out the candle which her husband had left burning, she slipped her bare feet into a pair of satin mules at the foot of the bed and went out on the porch, where she sat down in the wicker chair and began to rock gently to and fro. It was then past midnight. The cottages were all dark. A single faint light gleamed out from the hallway of the house. There was no sound abroad except the hooting of an old owl in the top of a water oak, and the everlasting voice of the sea that was not uplifted at that soft hour. It broke like a mournful lullaby upon the night. So notice that Miss Pontellier, she immediately gets up out of bed to go check on her son, right? She finds that her husband is right and she doesn't say anything. And so now she's mad and she's refusing to answer him. He goes out, and notice, he went to bed and in half a minute he was fast asleep. Now, isn't that interesting, I think, that this is an interesting juxtaposition, right, between the fact that, he wakes her up because she's not paying enough attention to him, but when he's ready to go to bed, he goes to bed and immediately falls asleep and has no problem falling asleep, and just leaves her with the aftermath of his tantrum. But at this point, she's thoroughly awake, right? So he's, basically dropped an emotional bomb and then left her to deal with it. She's crying, and she goes outside, which I think is important that she goes outside because, of course, we get the presence of nature. And then if you look here, there is lots of description of nature in this paragraph, right? You've got the time, it's past midnight, you've got this gleam of the moon, there's no sound except the hooting of an old owl, and then most importantly here, the everlasting voice of the sea, like a mournful lullaby. So in all of these emotional moments that we see in the novel, you've got the sea calling to Edna, right? So let's move on. The tears came so fast to Mrs. Pontellier's eyes that the damp sleeve of her peignoir no longer served to dry them. She was holding the back of her chair with one hand. Her loose sleeve had slipped almost to the shoulder of her uplifted arm. Turning, she thrust her face steaming and wet into the bend of her arm, and she went on crying there, not caring any longer to dry her face, her eyes, her arms. She could not have told why she was crying. Such experiences as the foregoing were not uncommon in her married life. They seemed never before to have weighed much against the abundance of her husband's kindness and a uniform devotion which had come to be tacit and self-understood. So here we see kind of the emotional aftermath. Her reaction to this little incident seems to be much stronger than what it would normally elicit, but I think the key to that here is this sentence. Such experiences as the foregoing were not uncommon in her married life. So you see here that this appears to be kind of the pattern of interaction of their marriage. that this is what it happens. And for some reason on this particular night, it's striking her as more strongly than it normally does. Also, what's important, I think, here is this abundance of kindness and goodness. You know, Leonce is not necessarily a bad guy. I think it would be easier for us if he was this horrible, abusive man, but he's not. And that tells us a little bit that perhaps what Chopin is trying to get across to us is that marriage is the issue, right? Marriage in general, not any particular marriage. That marriage in general might be oppressive to women, at least in the time period when this was written. So let's move on to the last section here. An indescribable oppression, which seemed to generate in some unfamiliar part of her consciousness, filled her whole being with a vague anguish. It was like a shadow, like a mist passing across her soul's summer's day. It was a strange and unfamiliar, it was a mood. She did not sit there inwardly upbraiding her husband, lamenting at fate, which had directed her footsteps to the path which they had taken. She was just having a good cry all to herself. The mosquitoes made merry over her, biting her firm, round arms and nipping at her bare insteps. The little stinging, buzzing imps succeeded in dispelling a mood which might have held her there in the darkness half a night longer. Now, look here, where it's described as an indescribable oppression, some unfamiliar part of her consciousness, right? Vague anguish. If you look at the language that is used to describe what's happening to her, right, all of this stuff is really amorphous. And I think, remember, this goes back to one of those things we're talking about in the naturalism, is this idea of the subconscious, the unconscious. She doesn't know why she's unhappy. She just does know that she's unhappy. And if we see here, you've got two separate similes, like a shadow, like a mist, and then a metaphor passing across her soul's summer's day. So if you've got this metaphor here, right? If you've got this metaphor here that her soul's summer's day, think about all of the things that you associate with summer, light, airy, happy, etc. And this vague, indescribable oppression, this unfamiliar part of her consciousness, notice that it's described as like a shadow, like a mist, right? So there's that, again, that juxtaposition between the summer and the shadow and the mist, that this darkness is coming across her soul's summer's day. And it's strange and unfamiliar, right? She, at this point, cannot articulate what is bothering her, but something is, in fact, bothering her. She doesn't sit there and lament her fate. She's not, at this point, unhappy that she, married her husband and it brought her here. She just knows that she's not in a good mood, that something bad has happened, and she's just having a good cry all by herself. Notice that what ends up making her go inside, you've got the mosquitoes made merry over her, biting her firm, round arms, and nipping at her bare insteps. You will see that as she's having this cry earlier up in the piece, it talks about the fact that the loose sleeve of her peignoir, right, is falling off. And as we go through this book, Edna gets nakeder and nakeder, and this seems to be sort of the first bareness that we see, because of course one of the things that we associate clothing with, one of the things that we associate clothing with is civilization, right? And so the fact that she's bare here is important, I think, because it's her first step towards putting off those social strictures, those social mores that tell her who and what she needs to be as a woman. So it's the insects themselves, the little stinging, buzzing imps that bring her out of the mood, that make her go inside. Now, interestingly enough, I would, think about that for a minute. The stinging, buzzing imps. If you're thinking about this as the first step in her awakening, and the idea that the core conflict in the particular novel is Edna versus social expectations and versus society, aren't these stinging, buzzing imps, maybe these are symbolic of what she's going to have to endure, right? Of the things that she's going to have to listen to. you know, sort of society's voices, maybe. The things she's going to have to listen to if she's going to be free. All right?